In the shadows of ancient castles, where moonlight dances with secrets and power flows through blood, love can be the most dangerous game of all. What happens when the most powerful creature in the supernatural world discovers that the woman he's sworn to protect is slowly dying right before his eyes? And worse yet, what if her death isn't natural, but the result of a carefully crafted betrayal from within his own trusted circle? This is a story about Elena Marchetti, a mortal woman who captured the heart of the most feared vampire in existence, and Damien Blackthorne, the vampire king whose centuries of wisdom failed him when it mattered most. Sometimes the greatest threat doesn't come from enemies you can see, but from the poison that seeps slowly through your defenses, drop by deadly drop. When love meets betrayal, when trust crumbles into dust, and when time becomes the enemy racing against a heartbeat that's growing weaker each day, even immortal power might not be enough to save what matters most. Elena Marchetti had always been delicate, like a flower that bloomed despite harsh winds. At least, that's what Damien Blackthorne told himself as he watched her sleep in their grand bedroom, her breathing shallow and labored. The morning light filtered through heavy curtains, casting gentle shadows across her pale face. She looked ethereal, almost ghostly. But Damien attributed this to her natural fragility rather than anything more sinister. The vampire king had ruled his domain for over 8 centuries, commanding respect and fear from supernatural creatures across the continent. His castle stood as a monument to his power, its gothic spires reaching toward the sky like ancient fingers. Within these walls, his word was law, his presence absolute. Yet as he gazed upon the sleeping woman who had somehow managed to capture his long-dead heart, Damien felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries. Helplessness. Elena stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering open to reveal emerald eyes that had once sparkled with life but now seemed dimmed by an invisible weight. She smiled at him, that same gentle smile that had first drawn him to her 3 years ago when she'd stumbled into his world quite by accident. She had been researching medieval architecture for her doctoral thesis, exploring abandoned castles throughout Romania, when she had discovered his very much occupied residence.
"Good morning, my love," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible.
Even this simple greeting seemed to exhaust her, and she closed her eyes again, as if the effort of speaking had drained her remaining energy. Damien moved with supernatural grace to sit beside her on the massive 4-poster bed. His pale hand, cold as marble, gently brushed a strand of dark hair from her forehead. Her skin felt warm against his touch, but not the healthy warmth of life. Rather, it carried an underlying heat that spoke of something working hard within her body, fighting an invisible battle. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Each day brought the same report: fatigue, weakness, a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of rest seemed to cure. Elena attempted to sit up, but the simple movement left her breathless. Damien immediately supported her with his arm, his supernatural strength making her seem weightless against him. "I'm fine," she lied, just as she had lied yesterday and the day before. "Just tired." The vampire king's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had noticed the changes gradually over the past 6 months. At first, it had been small things, Elena needing more sleep than usual, occasionally losing her appetite, sometimes feeling dizzy when she stood too quickly. Damien had dismissed these symptoms as natural human frailty. Mortals, he reasoned, were simply more susceptible to minor ailments than his kind. But as weeks turned into months, Elena's condition had steadily worsened. She had lost weight, her once healthy complexion growing increasingly pale. The vibrant woman who had once explored his vast castle with endless curiosity now rarely left their bedroom. The scholar who had spent hours in his ancient library, poring over manuscripts and asking him countless questions about history he had lived through, now found reading for more than a few minutes utterly exhausting. "Perhaps you should see a doctor," Damien suggested, not for the first time. He had made this recommendation repeatedly over the past month, but Elena had consistently refused. "Doctors ask too many questions," Elena replied weakly. "How would I explain living in a castle with a vampire? How would I explain any of this?" She gestured vaguely around the opulent bedroom with its medieval tapestries and modern amenities seamlessly blended together. Damien understood her concerns. Their relationship existed in a carefully maintained secret, hidden from both the human and supernatural worlds. Elena had left her old life behind gradually, telling her family and friends that she was pursuing extended research in Europe. Her occasional phone calls and carefully crafted social media posts maintained the illusion that she was simply traveling and studying abroad. The truth, that she had fallen in love with an immortal creature and chosen to share his eternal existence, was far too dangerous to reveal. "I could arrange for a private physician," Damien offered. "Someone discreet, who wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions. Elena shook her head slightly, even this small movement seeming to cost her considerable effort. It's probably just stress, adjusting to this life, to your world. It's been a lot of changes. Damien wanted to argue, to insist that she receive proper medical attention, but he found himself accepting her explanation. Perhaps she was right. The transition from mortal academic to the consort of the Vampire King had indeed been dramatic. Elena had shown remarkable resilience in adapting to his nocturnal lifestyle, to the strange customs of supernatural society, to the constant awareness that she was surrounded by creatures who could end her life without effort. The castle itself was home to more than just Damien. His inner circle consisted of several ancient vampires who served as advisors, lieutenants, and protectors of his realm. Marcus Blackwood, his oldest companion and closest friend, had been turned during the Renaissance and possessed a sharp intellect that made him invaluable as a strategist. Isabelle Rousseau, elegant and deadly, had joined their ranks during the French Revolution and now served as Damien's spy master, maintaining networks of information throughout Europe. Viktor Petrov, turned during the Russian Revolution, acted as the castle's guardian and enforcer. These vampires had initially been skeptical of Elena's presence. Humans were typically viewed as either food or temporary amusements, not as permanent residents of their immortal world. However, Elena's genuine kindness, her insatiable curiosity about their histories, and her obvious devotion to Damien had gradually won most of them over. She had become not just tolerated, but genuinely welcomed by many of the castle's supernatural inhabitants, or so Damien believed. As Elena drifted back to sleep, her breathing remaining troublingly shallow, Damien rose from the bed and walked to the tall windows overlooking his domain. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds, illuminating gardens that Elena had once loved to explore. She had spent countless hours among the ancient roses and carefully maintained hedges, finding peace in the beauty that surrounded his dark fortress. Now, those gardens remained untouched by her presence, the flowers blooming without her admiration, the paths empty of her footsteps. The change had been so gradual that Damien hadn't fully grasped how much Elena had withdrawn from the activities that once brought her joy. Her world had slowly contracted until it encompassed little more than their bedroom and the adjacent sitting room. A soft knock at the door interrupted his brooding. Marcus entered after receiving permission, his expression carefully neutral as he approached his old friend. The centuries had taught him to read Damien's moods with precision, and the tension radiating from the Vampire King was unmistakable. "How is she this morning?" Marcus asked quietly, his gaze drifting briefly to the sleeping figure on the bed. "The same," Damien replied, his voice carrying an edge of frustration that he rarely revealed. "Weak, tired, unwell." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. He had observed Elena's decline as well, though he had been careful not to comment directly on her condition. The relationship between Damien and Elena was complex enough without additional supernatural perspectives complicating matters. "Perhaps," Marcus said carefully, "it would be wise to consider the possibility that her illness has supernatural origins." Damien turned sharply to face his advisor. "What do you mean? Mortals who spend extended periods in our world sometimes experience complications," Marcus explained. "Our very presence, our energy, can sometimes affect humans in unexpected ways. It's possible that prolonged exposure to our supernatural nature is causing her body to react poorly." This possibility had never occurred to Damien. In all his centuries of existence, he had rarely formed lasting relationships with humans. His previous encounters with mortals had been brief, feeding, temporary companionship, or business arrangements that concluded quickly. Elena was his first experience with a long-term human companion, and he realized with growing unease that he had no baseline for what was normal. "You think I'm making her sick?" The words came out harsher than Damien intended, but the implications were staggering. The idea that his love for Elena might be literally killing her was almost too terrible to contemplate.
"Not intentionally," Marcus replied carefully.
"But supernatural exposure can manifest in many ways. Some humans develop resistances and thrive in our presence. Others don't." The thought hung heavy in the air between them. Damien had always known that his relationship with Elena existed under the shadow of her mortality. He had planned to eventually offer her the choice of transformation, to grant her the immortality that would allow them to spend eternity together. But he had wanted to give her more time as a human, more opportunity to be certain of her decision before taking the irrevocable step into darkness. Now, faced with the possibility that his very presence might be poisoning her, Damien wondered if time was a luxury they no longer possessed. The irony was bitter. The vampire, who had waited centuries to find love, might be forced to act quickly to save it. After Marcus departed, Damien returned to Elena's bedside, studying her sleeping form with new eyes. Her skin had taken on an almost translucent quality, the blue veins visible beneath the surface. Her breathing was quick and shallow, as if her body was working harder than it should to maintain basic functions. Dark circles had formed beneath her eyes, giving her face a gaunt appearance that was becoming more pronounced each day. How had he failed to recognize the severity of her condition? Damien prided himself on his observational skills, honed by centuries of political intrigue and supernatural warfare. Yet somehow, he had allowed his emotional attachment to cloud his judgment. He had seen what he wanted to see, Elena adjusting to their life together, rather than what was actually happening before his eyes. The realization that he might be the cause of her suffering struck him like a physical blow. Damien had committed many acts of violence and cruelty throughout his long existence. He had killed enemies, destroyed rivals, and shown mercy only when it served his purposes. But the thought that he might be unknowingly harming the one person he truly loved was agony beyond anything he had ever experienced. Elena stirred again, her eyes opening to find him watching her. She managed another weak smile, reaching up with one trembling hand to touch his face. Her fingers felt fragile against his skin, like autumn leaves that might crumble at the slightest pressure. "Don't look so worried," she whispered. "I'm stronger than I look." But even as she spoke the words, Damien could see the lie in them. Elena was not stronger than she looked. She was exactly as fragile as she appeared, possibly more so. And for the first time since she had entered his life, Damien began to seriously consider the possibility that love alone might not be enough to protect her from the dangers that surrounded his world. The afternoon brought no improvement. Elena managed to eat a few spoonfuls of soup that the castle staff had prepared especially for her, but even this small accomplishment left her exhausted. She spent most of the day sleeping, waking only briefly for water or to reassure Damien that she was feeling better, though her appearance contradicted every such claim. As evening approached and the castle came alive with the stirring of its nocturnal inhabitants, Damien made a decision. Regardless of Elena's objections, he would arrange for medical attention. If her condition had supernatural origins, conventional medicine might prove useless. But he had to explore every possibility. The alternative, watching her slowly fade away while he remained helpless, was unacceptable. He also resolved to consult with the other members of his inner circle. If Marcus was correct about supernatural exposure causing health problems in humans, then Isabel and Victor might have additional insights. Between the three of them, they had centuries of experience with the supernatural world and its effects on mortals. That night, as Elena slept fitfully beside him, Damien lay awake planning his next moves. He had spent 8 centuries building his power, establishing his domain, and protecting what was his. Now, faced with the possibility of losing the most important thing in his world, he was prepared to use every resource at his disposal. But first, he had to acknowledge the truth that was becoming impossible to ignore. Elena was not simply tired or weak. She was seriously ill, and her condition was deteriorating rapidly. Whatever was causing her decline needed to be identified and addressed before it was too late. The vampire king, who had once believed himself immune to fear, now found himself terrified by the prospect of a world without Elena Marchetti. And in that fear, the first seeds of a terrible suspicion began to take root. Because sometimes, the most dangerous enemies are the ones who smile while they destroy everything you hold dear. In the shadows of ancient castles, where moonlight dances with secrets and power flows through blood, love can be the most dangerous game of all. Damien's discovery of Isabel's betrayal left him standing in her private chambers, surrounded by the evidence of months of calculated murder, feeling as though the world had tilted off its axis. The elegant French vampire who had served as his spy master for over 2 centuries, who had shared his secrets and his trust, had been systematically destroying the only thing that truly mattered to him. The journal entries revealed not just the method of Elena's poisoning, but the twisted psychology behind it. Isabel had convinced herself that she was saving Damien from a mistake, protecting him from the complications of a mortal lover. Her jealousy had transformed into a delusion of righteousness, where murder became an act of devotion rather than betrayal. But what chilled Damien most was the realization that Isabel's plan had nearly succeeded. If he hadn't finally overcome his denial about Elena's condition, if Dr. Chen hadn't identified the wolfsbane poisoning, Elena would have died within weeks. Damien would have mourned her as a victim of human frailty, never suspecting that one of his most trusted advisors had orchestrated her death with surgical precision. The Vampire King carefully returned everything to its original position, leaving no trace of his midnight investigation. Isabel could not be allowed to suspect that her secret had been discovered, not yet. Damien needed time to plan his response, to decide how to handle a betrayal that cut deeper than any wound he had suffered in 8 centuries of existence. He spent the remaining hours before dawn in his study, staring at maps and documents while his mind raced through possibilities and implications. The knowledge that Isabel had been deceiving him for months, perhaps years, called into question every piece of intelligence she had gathered, every strategic recommendation she had made. How much of his recent decision-making had been influenced by someone whose ultimate loyalty lay with her own obsessions rather than his interests? Marcus found him there as the sun rose, still sitting in the same chair where he had spent the night grappling with the magnitude of Isabel's treachery. The older vampire took one look at Damien's expression and immediately recognized that something fundamental had changed. "You found something," Marcus observed, closing the study door behind him and activating the privacy wards that would prevent supernatural eavesdropping. "I've found everything," Damien replied, his voice deadly calm. "Isabel has been poisoning Elena with wolfsbane, administered through herbal teas over the past 6 months. She documented the entire process in a private journal, including her motivations and her plans for Elena's eventual death." Marcus absorbed this revelation in silence, his ancient features reflecting the same shock and betrayal that Damien was experiencing. Isabel had been part of their inner circle for centuries, a trusted advisor whose intelligence networks had helped maintain their political dominance throughout Europe. The idea that she had been operating as a secret enemy within their most intimate councils was staggering. "What do you intend to do?" Marcus asked carefully. Damien rose from his chair and moved to the windows, gazing out at his domain with eyes that held the cold fury of a predator who had been wounded by prey. "I intend to give Isabel exactly what she deserves, but first, I need to ensure Elena's complete recovery and safety. Our poisoner cannot be allowed to threaten her again, and I will not risk any possibility that Isabel might have additional contingencies in place." "The others should be informed," Marcus suggested. "Victor needs to know that we have a traitor in our inner circle, and security protocols will need to be completely revised." "Not yet," Damien decided. "Isabel must not suspect that we know the truth. If she realizes her plan has been discovered, she might flee or attempt to destroy evidence. Worse, she might have prepared other methods to eliminate Elena if the poisoning failed. I want her to believe she is still undetected, while I decide how to handle this situation." The next few days required acting skills that Damien had not used since his mortal youth, centuries before he had gained the power to simply take what he wanted. He maintained his usual interactions with Isabel, accepting her expressions of concern for Elena's condition, listening to her suggestions for improving castle security, allowing her to continue in her role as spy master, while knowing that every word she spoke might be a lie designed to further her hidden agenda. Isabel, for her part, seemed genuinely pleased by the reports of Elena's improving condition at the private medical facility. She expressed relief that the mysterious illness was finally responding to treatment, and she even offered to prepare special herbal blends that might help Elena's recovery once she returned to the castle. The casual way Isabel made this offer, the same herbal blends that had been slowly killing Elena for months, filled Damien with such rage that he had to excuse himself from the conversation to prevent his supernatural nature from erupting in violence. The woman's audacity was breathtaking, her ability to maintain a facade of caring while planning murder almost beyond comprehension. During this period of careful deception, Damien also began investigating the broader implications of Isabel's betrayal. Using his own intelligence networks, separate from those controlled by his treacherous spy master, he sought to determine if Isabel had been working alone or as part of a larger conspiracy. What he discovered was both relieving and disturbing. Isabel appeared to have acted entirely on her own, driven by personal obsession rather than political motivation. However, her position as spy master had given her access to sensitive information about Damien's activities, his allies, his weaknesses. If she had chosen to sell that information to his enemies, the damage could have been catastrophic. More investigation revealed that Isabel had indeed been using her position to gather intelligence, but not for external buyers. Instead, she had been compiling detailed dossiers on everyone who might potentially challenge her claim to Damien's affections. Her files contained information about several mortal women who had briefly caught Damien's attention over the years, as well as vampire females who had attempted to court his favor. The scope of Isabel's obsession was truly staggering. She had been monitoring and manipulating Damien's romantic life for decades, subtly sabotaging potential relationships and eliminating perceived threats through various means. Elena had simply been her most significant and persistent target, the one who had required the most extreme measures to remove. Meanwhile, Elena's recovery at the private medical facility was progressing better than Dr. Chen had initially hoped. The wolfsbane was being flushed from her system through a combination of specialized treatments, and her natural resilience was helping her body repair the damage that months of poisoning had caused. Daily phone calls with Damien provided emotional support that seemed to accelerate her physical healing. "I'm feeling stronger every day," Elena reported during one of their conversations. "Chen says I might be able to come home next week if these improvements continue." Damien felt his heart lighten at the word home. Despite everything that had happened, Elena still considered the castle her home, still wanted to return to their life together. The thought that Isabel's betrayal might have destroyed not just Elena's health, but also her trust in their shared world, had been one of his greatest fears. "I'm looking forward to having you back," Damien replied, meaning every word, while also recognizing that Elena's return would force him to finally confront the traitor in their midst. "But don't rush your recovery. I want you completely well before you come home." After ending the call, Damien realized that the time for planning was nearly over. Elena would indeed be returning within days, and he could not allow Isabel another opportunity to harm her. The confrontation that he had been avoiding could no longer be delayed. That evening, Damien requested a private meeting with Isabel in his study. She arrived promptly, elegant as always in a midnight blue dress that complemented her pale complexion. Her expression was pleasant and professional, showing no sign of the murderous obsession that her journal had revealed. "You wanted to see me?" Isabel asked, settling gracefully into the chair across from his desk. "I did," Damien replied, his tone carefully neutral. "I've been thinking about Elena's illness, about how it developed and persisted for so long without obvious cause. It's made me realize how vulnerable we've allowed ourselves to become." Isabel nodded sympathetically. "It has been concerning. A mysterious illness striking someone under our protection reflects poorly on our security measures. Perhaps when Elena returns, we should implement additional precautions." "Oh, I intend to implement many new precautions," Damien said softly, "starting with a complete review of everyone who had access to Elena during her illness." Something flickered in Isabel's eyes, a momentary uncertainty that was quickly masked by professional interest. "Of course. I'll begin preparing a comprehensive report on all personnel who interacted with her." "That won't be necessary," Damien replied, rising from his chair and moving to stand behind Isabel. His movement was casual, but it effectively blocked her access to the door. "You see, I've already completed my own investigation." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, and Isabel's supernatural senses finally recognized the danger she was in. Her posture stiffened slightly, though she attempted to maintain her facade of innocence. "I'm not sure I understand," she said carefully. Damien walked to a cabinet across the room and withdrew a familiar journal. Isabel's private record of Elena's poisoning. He placed it on the desk between them, watching as Isabel's face went pale with shock and dawning terror. "This is quite fascinating reading," Damien said conversationally. "Particularly your detailed notes about dosage calculations and the progression of wolfsbane toxicity. Very thorough work, I must say." Isabel stared at the journal as if it were a venomous snake, her centuries of composure finally beginning to crack. "Damien, I can explain." "Please do," he interrupted, his voice carrying the dangerous edge that had once made hardened warriors flee in terror. "Explain how someone I trusted with my life, with my secrets, with the security of everything I'd built, decided that the best way to serve me was by murdering the woman I love." The last traces of Isabel's mask finally fell away, revealing the obsession and desperation that had driven her to such extremes. "She was destroying you," Isabel said, her voice rising with emotion. "Can't you see what she was doing to you? Making you weak, making you vulnerable, turning you into something pathetic and human." Damien's supernatural aura filled the room, pressing against Isabel with the weight of 8 centuries of accumulated power. "Continue. I've served you faithfully for over 200 years, Isabel continued, her words tumbling out in a rush of justification and delusion. "I've protected your interests, expanded your influence, eliminated your enemies. I've loved you longer and more truly than that mortal child ever could. And you threw it all away for what? For someone who will age and die and leave you with nothing?" "Elena made me feel alive again," Damien replied coldly. "You apparently made me a fool. How long have you been manipulating my personal life? How many other women have suffered because of your jealousy?" Isabel's laugh held a note of hysteria. "Does it matter? They were all unworthy of you, all temporary distractions that would have passed in time. But she made you talk of transformation. of eternity together. I couldn't allow that. So you decided to play God with our lives, Damien said. You decided that your jealousy and obsession were more important than my choices, my happiness, my love. I decided to save you from making the greatest mistake of your immortal existence. Isabel shot back, her composure completely shattered now. She doesn't understand our world, our nature. She would have become a burden, a weakness that your enemies could exploit. I was protecting everything we've built together. Damien moved with supernatural speed, appearing beside Isabel's chair before she could react. His hand closed around her throat with just enough pressure to remind her of his superior strength without actually cutting off her air supply. We built nothing together, he said quietly. I built an empire, and you served it faithfully until your petty jealousy turned you into the very enemy you claimed to protect me from.
Elena never threatened what I am or what I've accomplished.
But you turned my own sanctuary into a hunting ground. Isabel's eyes showed a flicker of the madness that had driven her to such extremes. Kill me then, she whispered. But know that without me, without my networks, without my intelligence operations, your empire will crumble within decades. I am indispensable to you, Damien. Even now, even after this, you need me more than you need her. The arrogance of her statement, the assumption that her professional value could outweigh attempted murder, nearly pushed Damien over the edge into uncontrolled violence. For a moment, his grip tightened on her throat, and Isabel's eyes widened as she realized how close to death she truly was. But then Damien released her and stepped back, his expression settling into the cold mask of judgment that had terrified supernatural creatures across Europe for centuries. You're right about one thing, he said finally. Killing you would create certain complications. Your intelligence networks are valuable, and they would be difficult to rebuild quickly. So instead, I'm going to give you a choice, the same kind of choice you denied Elena. Isabel rubbed her throat, watching him warily. What kind of choice? You can leave, Damien said simply. Tonight, forever. Take nothing but the clothes you're wearing and disappear from my territory, from my sight, from my existence. In return, I'll allow you to live, and I'll give you a 24-hour head start before I inform the supernatural community that you are no longer under my protection. The implications of his offer sank in immediately. Without Damien's protection, Isabel would be vulnerable to every enemy she had made during her centuries as his spy master. There were many supernatural creatures who would love to settle old scores with someone who had once been untouchable. And the alternative? She asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. The alternative is that I demonstrate to you exactly why others have feared me for 8 centuries, Damien replied. I will make your death so slow, so agonizing, that it will serve as a lesson to anyone else who might consider betraying my trust. And before you die, you will watch me systematically destroy everything you've ever cared about, everyone who ever showed you kindness. Isabel stared at him in horror, finally understanding the magnitude of what she had unleashed. She had awakened something in Damien that had been dormant for decades, the ancient predator who had built his empire through ruthless violence and absolute dominance. Choose now, Damien commanded, because my patience with you ended the moment I discovered your journal. Tears that Isabel hadn't shed in 2 centuries began to flow down her pale cheeks as she realized that her obsession had cost her everything. Not only had she failed to eliminate Elena, but she had destroyed her own life in the process. The love she had imagined she felt for Damien was revealed as nothing more than possessive madness that had blinded her to the consequences of her actions. I'll leave, she whispered finally. But Damien, I did love you. Everything I did because I loved you. No, Damien replied coldly. Everything you did because you loved yourself more. Love doesn't murder innocent people. Love doesn't betray trust. Love doesn't turn a sanctuary into a place of fear and suspicion. What you felt for me was obsession, possession, jealousy, everything except love. Within an hour, Isabel Rousseau had vanished from Blackthorn Castle, disappearing into the night with nothing but the terror of what would happen if she ever crossed Damien's path again. Her departure left a hole in the castle's operations that would take months to fill, but it also removed a cancer that had been growing within their inner circle for longer than anyone had realized. The next morning, Damien gathered Marcus and Victor to inform them of what had transpired. Both vampires listened in stunned silence as he recounted Isabel's betrayal and the evidence he had discovered. The revelation that someone they had trusted for centuries had been capable of such calculated evil shook them both deeply. How long do you think she was planning this? Victor asked finally. According to her journal, She began considering Elena's elimination almost from the moment they first met, Damien replied. The actual poisoning started about 6 months ago, when it became clear that I intended to offer Elena the choice of transformation. Marcus shook his head in dismay. 3 years of planning. 3 years of watching and waiting and plotting murder. How did we not see the signs? Because we trusted her, Damien said simply. Because we believed that centuries of loyal service meant something to her. Because we failed to recognize that obsession can masquerade as devotion until it's too late. The conversation that followed covered the practical implications of Isabel's departure, the intelligence networks that would need to be rebuilt, the security protocols that would need to be revised, the allies who would need to be informed about changes in their command structure. But beneath those practical concerns lay a deeper wound that would take much longer to heal. The betrayal had shattered something fundamental about the trust that bound their inner circle together. Moving forward, they would all be more cautious, more suspicious, more aware that loyalty could not be taken for granted simply because it had existed for centuries. Isabel's legacy would be a permanent reminder that even the closest advisors could harbor deadly secrets. But despite the damage that had been done, Damien found himself looking forward rather than backward. Elena was recovering. The immediate threat to her life had been eliminated, and soon she would be coming home to a castle that was finally safe for her. The future they had planned together was still possible, and that knowledge gave him strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. 6 months after Isabel's banishment, Blackthorn Castle had transformed into something neither Elena nor Damien could have imagined during the darkest days of her poisoning. The Gothic fortress that had once been a place of shadows and secrets had become a true home, strengthened by the trials they had survived together and the trust they had rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal. Elena's complete physical recovery had taken longer than anyone anticipated, but her determination to not just survive but thrive had impressed even Dr. Chen. The wolfsbane poisoning had left her immune system compromised for months, requiring careful monitoring and gradual increases in activity. However, Elena had approached her recovery with the same scholarly dedication she had once applied to her doctoral research, learning everything she could about toxicology, supernatural threats, and defensive techniques that might protect her in the future. The transformation in Elena's character was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of her recovery. The gentle, trusting woman who had first stumbled into Damien's world had evolved into someone harder, more cautious, but also more resilient. She had lost her innocence about the dangers that surrounded supernatural society, but she had gained something more valuable: the strength to face those dangers without flinching. "I want to learn how to fight," Elena announced one evening as she and Damien walked through the castle's renovated gardens. The wolfsbane plants that had once grown in a hidden corner of the grounds had been completely removed, replaced with roses that bloomed in defiance of the approaching winter. Damien paused beside a fountain that reflected moonlight like scattered diamonds. "Are you certain? Combat training is physically demanding, and your recovery is complete," Elena interrupted firmly. "Dr. Chen cleared me for all normal activities last week, and this isn't about my physical recovery anymore. This is about my mental recovery. I need to know that I can protect myself, that I'm not helpless against the kinds of threats that exist in your world." The request didn't surprise Damien, though it did concern him. He understood Elena's need to feel empowered after months of helplessness, but the idea of her deliberately placing herself in danger, even in a controlled training environment, activated every protective instinct he possessed. "Victor would be the logical choice for combat instruction," Damien said finally. "He has the most experience with training mortals in defensive techniques." "I was thinking more along the lines of comprehensive education," Elena replied. "Combat training, yes, but also politics, supernatural law, the kind of intelligence work that Isabel used to handle. If I'm going to be your partner in this life, I want to be a true partner, not just someone you have to protect." The conversation continued as they completed their circuit of the gardens, with Elena outlining her vision for taking a more active role in the supernatural community that surrounded Blackthorn Castle. Her plans were ambitious but not unrealistic, built on her academic background and her hard-earned understanding of the complexities that govern vampire society. Damien found himself both impressed and terrified by Elena's transformation. The woman walking beside him was still recognizably the person he had fallen in love with, but she had been forged by betrayal and near death into something stronger and more formidable. The innocence that had first attracted him was gone, replaced by a wisdom that made her even more compelling. Over the following weeks, Elena began her education in the darker arts of supernatural survival. Victor proved to be an excellent combat instructor, teaching her defensive techniques that emphasize speed and cunning over brute strength. Marcus provided lessons in vampire politics and history, helping her understand the complex web of alliances and rivalries that shaped their world. Most importantly, Elena began developing her own intelligence network, using her academic credentials and research skills to gather information through channels that had been unavailable to Isabel. Her approach was more subtle and scholarly than Isabel's had been, focusing on understanding patterns and connections rather than accumulating secrets for their own sake. The work was challenging and sometimes dangerous, but Elena threw herself into it with an intensity that reminded Damien of her original doctoral research. She possessed a natural gift for seeing connections that others missed, and her academic training in historical research translated surprisingly well to intelligence analysis. "She's impressive," Marcus observed to Damien one evening after Elena had successfully identified a potential threat to one of their allied covens before it could develop into a serious problem. "Her methods are completely different from Isabel's, but perhaps more effective in the long run." Damien nodded, watching through the study's windows as Elena practiced combat forms with Victor in the castle's courtyard. Her movements were still those of a relative beginner, but her dedication and natural athleticism were evident in every precise strike and defensive position. "She's building something that Isabel never understood," Damien replied. "Isabel collected secrets like weapons, tools to be used against people when the opportunity arose. Elena gathers information to understand and protect. The difference in motivation makes all the difference in effectiveness." The observation was more profound than either vampire initially realized. "Where, Isabel?"